it has also signed its own kind of legal and official documentation recognizing the PRC and engaging in bilateral relations with China. And what's interesting about that document is that even though it was signed, over 35 years now, sorry, more than that, even if it was signed almost 5 decades ago, it still actually has some legal value because the EU and China have really struggled since to come to terms on a kind of upgrading of that. And I'll touch upon this as we move forward. Fast forwarding to the 21st century, their relationship was upgraded to the term Comprehensive Strategic Partnership at a time when the Brussels and Beijing were entertaining what is called in the literature the honeymoon period. This is not a term which I'm making up. It's other scholars who came up with this very fanciful term. Basically, that's just to say that at the beginning of the 21st century, the EU and China had very good relations. And some scholars, commentators, policymakers, I think they really believed that there was real potential for the EU and China to take their relationship to a place which could perhaps shape the world towards multilateralism or multipolarity, depending on where you stand. Of course, this was in the heydays before the arrival of Xi Jinping as president of China, of course, which is going to be a bit of a game changer in that regard. Now, EU-China relations really stands for one thing and one thing only. It's not really security, it's trade. Trade and, to a lesser extent, investment. Now, up until the year 2020, the EU and China, in fact, the EU was China's largest trading partner in volume, okay? So the volume, as recorded in 2019, was of the order of about 600 billion euros. Now, the EU is superseded, interestingly enough, by the region where I currently find myself, so ASEAN, of which Malaysia is a member. So ASEAN is now China's largest trade partner, and the EU has been relegated to second place. Now, in terms of the kind of structure of their bilateral relations, the EU and China, because they have this comprehensive strategic partnership, if you like, it puts a lot of emphasis on rhetoric, on discourse. Okay, so they like when you read, for example, joint policy documents, or even individual policy documents or statements which are made by both sides, when you read them, it gives you a sense that they actually, have faith in one another. But when you actually look behind, these kind of very nice words, you can soon realize that, in fact, the EU and China like to talk a lot, but they don't actually do very much. Now, this being said, I know I've started the lecture on a rather cynical note here, but this being said, when you look at the kind of institutional structure which underpins EU-China relations, there is something there, okay? Now, as mentioned, for instance, you have the publication of a number of policy papers. And actually, this is, by Chinese foreign policy standards, this is quite uncommon. Now, China has published policy papers for various regions in the world. Okay, so for instance, on Africa, on the region of Central America, Latin America, and the Caribbean, on the Gulf and the Middle East. So China's kind of sporadically written policy papers here and there. But on the EU, China has been prolific at generating policy papers, either individually or in conjunction with the EU. And the EU, through its various organs, and most notably its the European Commission, which is the executive branch of the kind of the EU's administration, if you like, or administrative body, has also written countless country strategy papers directed at China. So they do have, in a way, this kind of, if you look at the archives of EU-China relations, you can find quite a lot of documentation there. In addition to this, the EU and China entertain roughly about 60 sectoral dialogues, which concern matters as wide as, human rights, It can be about technical aspects of trade. It can be on climate change. You know, it goes on and on. So when you look at this on paper, it looks quite impressive. You know, you got all these kind of levels of interaction between various Chinese ministries and those officials working for the European Union in various capacities. And lastly, at the very highest level of EU-China relations, you have, of course, yearly bilateral summits, which brings together normally the president of China or his foreign minister, if you can call him like that, with all of the heads of states of the 27 member states of the EU. So in France's case, Macron. In Germany's case, it would have been Angela Merkel before she stepped down recently. And just under that, you also have, since the year 2011, the establishment of a high-level strategic dialogue mechanism, which is represented on the EU side by the EU's High Representative for Foreign Affairs, which is currently Mr. Josep Borrell. And on the Chinese side, it's usually a standing member of the State Council. And so the aim there is for them to discuss elements of a strategic nature concerning EU-China relations, which often touches upon other parts of the world. So it could also involve discussions about the Indian Ocean region. And then leaders on both sides tend to meet in kind of other fora, such as at the ASEM meetings, the Asia-Europe meetings, or on the sidelines of, kind of bilateral meetings between, an EU member state with China, or, on the sidelines of other kind of multilateral meetings as well. So between the EU and China, there is lots of dialogue. There are lots of policy papers. There's lots of, interaction, verbal interaction or written interaction. But for all this written interaction, for all these policy papers, for all these different kind of mechanisms for interaction, the reality is that the EU and China's relations are largely characterized by mistrust. Okay, that's, I think, a point I'm going to try and put the emphasis on throughout the lecture here today. Now, why is this? Why is it that the EU and China fail to trust each other that much? Well, I've given here 7 reasons. That's quite a lot. Let me run through them in kind of order of importance. So the first reason I could give is ultimately, and this won't really come as a surprise to any of you, the EU and China don't trust each other. Why? Because on the one hand, you've got the most liberal of liberal political organizations, right? The EU believes in democracy, rule of law, the protection of human rights. Now, of course, you can criticize the EU for not being perfect at defending human rights, at upholding the rule of law, and there are many flaws there, but ultimately that's what the EU stands for, okay? To be an EU member state, you must be a democratically elected or a democratic country, full stop. There's no room for any kind of authoritarianism of any shape or form, although that is also subject to criticism. And of course, on the other hand, you have China, right? China, which is the epitome of authoritarianism, of strict control, of restriction of freedoms, and so on and so forth. I'm not really teaching you anything new here. So because the EU and China basically stand at opposing sides of the political spectrum, they've often had that difficulty of bridging their gap, the gap of political trust. The second element is, and this I think might be also quite pertinent to the lecture here today, is the role that the United States plays in all of this. Now, for those of you who are not necessarily familiar with Europe, one thing about Europe is that the United States today continues to provide and pay for Europe's security. So by that, what I mean is the presence of American troops on the European continent, the NATO alliance, which basically guarantees that any NATO country which comes under attack will have the activation of a common mutual defense agreement. And that ultimately the US has underpinned European security since the tail end of World War II, and particularly relevant during the Cold War era as well. So this is something which, of course, upset particularly Donald Trump when he was president of the United States. He criticized European countries for being free riders. And in Europe, on and off, there's always been this discussion in the back burner about whether there should be such a thing as a European army. But all of that is more hearsay than actual fact today. So that means that because Washington plays this kind of linchpin role in assuring European security, it also gives Washington a certain degree of control over what European countries and the EU can do with regards to matters of strategic relevance. And because China is now, the US's #1 strategic rival, Washington is, of course, very concerned about what its allies do in dealing with China. So as you can see nowadays, the Biden administration working hard to get the Japanese, the South Koreans, the Australians on board for containing China in the Indo-Pacific. Well, Washington expects the same of European countries. So it's not really in America's interest to let the EU drift too close towards China. But actually, that's been a source of tension between Washington and Brussels over the years, because European countries want more independence from America. And they don't always align themselves perfectly with what Washington wants as well. So, for example, when there was a trade war led by Trump against China, the Europeans did not want any part of it. But for the main problem here is really more for China, because China knows that ultimately it can only really aspire to have relations with the EU, which will always be kind of set against the benchmark of the proximity between the United States and the EU. So China knows that it deals with Europe, but it's also somehow dealing with the United States, and that's a reality which also tends to undermine the quality of EU-China relations. The third issue of concern, and here actually the EU joins or rejoins the position of the United States, is that the EU's own trade relations with China are quite skewed, meaning that the EU runs a large trade deficit with China, similar to the United States. And so for the best part of 2 decades now, the EU has been railing at the Chinese for them not helping to bring down the volume of the trade deficit. So, typical of an industrialized economy, the EU buys lots of manufactured goods from China, but doesn't export much to China because it doesn't make anything anymore, or not much anymore, except for Germany. Germany is probably Europe's last big manufacturing bastion, and the only EU member state which has a positive trade balance with China is Germany. So that's also caused its own set of disgruntlement, because other European countries like France or Italy, Spain, Greece, are kind of upset in a way at the Germans for dominating EU-China relations because it's beneficial for Germany. So that's also kind of created its own element of distrust, if you like. The fourth reason is because there are long-standing issues which have not been solved in the scope of EU-China relations, which continue to haunt Brussels and Beijing today. The first one is that the EU still refuses to grant China market economy status at the World Trade Organization for quite obvious reasons, because if it did so, then that would mean even more Chinese goods flooded into Europe, which would mean more unemployment. And as you probably know, some European countries already have their fair share of unemployment. France is around 10% of the labor market, which is too much, basically, although actually the numbers have been dropping since COVID. That's one issue. The other issue is the arms embargo, which the EU imposed upon China, as the United States did in 1989, following what happened in Tiananmen Square. And the EU has kind of a couple of occasions since contemplated lifting the arms embargo. Now, the arms embargo basically prevents European countries from selling, military equipment such as missiles, tanks, automatic weapons directly to the People's Liberation Army. Now, the Chinese can purchase commercial goods which can have a dual use purpose. Okay, that is not prohibited. But all the heavy artillery stuff is prohibited. And China's long railed against this, saying that it's unjust, that it's a relic from the past, that the EU should get rid of it. But every time the EU has tried to lift it, something has happened. For example, in 2005, there was a really strong chance that the EU was going to lift the arms embargo, and then China voted through the 2005 anti-secession law, which basically gave the Chinese government the legal right to intervene in Taiwan if Taiwan declared secession from mainland China. Okay, so that spooked European countries who then said, no, we don't want to do this. We think it's a bad idea. And on top of that, coming back to my earlier point, the Americans, they fear this because they don't want to find themselves in a situation of potential conflict with China, where the Chinese army is using European-made military technology against the Americans and its allies. Okay, so because that would also cause a certain degree of mistrust between America and Europe. So I don't think it's going to be lifted anytime soon. But anyway, the Chinese continue to complain about this. There are other issues. So, for example, the EU, the European Parliament, one of the institutions of the EU, every year awards a prize called the Sakharov Prize, which is usually nominated or attributed to human rights activists around the world, usually located in authoritarian states, as a way of promoting human rights, the rule of law, and democracy. So the last one to have, in this context, to have received it in 2019 was a Uyghur scholar named Ilham Tohti. He was awarded the Sakharov Prize for his research for, I think he's been imprisoned for the longest of time, simply because he's a Uyghur Muslim, and that's in China quite a sensitive topic these days. And he was awarded the prize. And of course, you can imagine that really upset the Chinese leadership. So these kind of things happen every so on, which contribute to mistrust. Unsurprisingly, the EU and China don't see eye to eye on Taiwan. Actually, the Taiwanese foreign minister made a trip to Europe in November because Taiwan is getting quite a lot of support, especially from countries in Eastern and Central Europe, such as Lithuania, such as the Czech Republic. And that's, of course, upsetting the Chinese again. And Hong Kong, I think the EU has been one of the most outspoken entities with regards to Hong Kong, because it has provided a home for some of the kind of pro-democracy activists who've had to leave Hong Kong, and therefore it's another point of contention between the EU and China. The sixth reason I've touched upon quite a bit already is a lot of talk and not much action. But I will add here that China has proven quite good over the years at dividing and conquering the EU, mostly by playing off member states against each other, looking for the weak member state link in the batch. So I would say that of late, the easy target here is Hungary under the leadership of Viktor Orban, which is probably the least democratic of all EU member states. And Orban has grown to be quite the fan of China, and has often used support from China as a kind of battle ram against the other member states and against the EU institutions. A good example of China playing off different countries against one another would be the 17+1 forum, set up in the scope of the Belt and Road Initiative. So it's the China and Central Eastern European Forum, where they discuss, amongst other things like infrastructure investments. Now, the EU has always looked upon this as a threat. Why does China need to interact with countries in Central and Eastern Europe, most of whom are already member states, when, the EU and China has all of these kind of other forums for interaction? And although the Chinese have said officially that, this does not impact upon the nature of EU-China relations, Brussels does not see it that way. So that's also kind of contributed to mistrust on the EU side. And to make matters worse, in 2019, you had a new European Commission cabinet kind of elected after the 2019 European parliamentary elections. And the new commission came in, and in its latest China policy paper, finally admitted that China was a quote unquote strategic rival, similar to the United States, similar to Japan. And so, of course, well, you know, now China knows where it stands. So no more talk of the honeymoon period. That's all done and dusted. And over the past 18 months or so, the EU and China have fallen out even further over the Comprehensive Agreement on Investment, which is a bilateral investment treaty, been under negotiation for the past 9 years. Okay, the European Council, sorry, the EU Council, the leaders of the various EU member states had finally come round to ratifying it, only for China to respond to sanctions imposed on it by the EU with its own set of sanctions on members of the European Parliament, European think tanks, on very select individuals or groups. And that happened just before the European Parliament was supposed to ratify the Comprehensive Agreement on Investment. So it's now been frozen again. And that's because of their two distinct positions over what's happening in Xinjiang province, with the EU more and more vocal and critical of what's happening there, and China telling the EU, it's none of your business, stay out of your business when you are not needed. So that's basically to give you, you know, the kind of the run through of where the EU and China stand in terms of their bilateral relations. Now let's move this into the context of the Indian Ocean region. So what is the EU's position with regards to the security dynamics of the IOR? Well, first and foremost, the EU is concerned with the economic well-being of the region, and most importantly, on the free flow of goods to and from Asia, and thus wants to maintain stability and predictability. So the EU's really concerned, or real concern, is to preserve the status quo. Okay, so the EU depends on, for example, the choke points in the Straits of Malacca remaining open, and that the Indian Ocean is an area or a kind of larger basin, if you like, which is free to traverse in terms of commercial shipping without any hindrances. That's the EU's predominant concern. So, of course, the EU is concerned, naturally, about any event which could bring that into disrepute. So, first of all, conventional threats, such as what the issue or the developments that we've seen over the past few years in the South China Sea. And I'll come back to this point a little bit later. But there are other issues which concern the EU, which don't necessarily relate to China, such as the kind of belligerence of the Iranians in the Straits of Hormuz, in the Red Sea, and non-conventional threats as well, such as piracy or acts of terrorism too. So you can see, for example, that in the fight against piracy, the EU was actually one of the most proactive actors in that particular context. It sent its first ever naval operation called EU NAVFOR Atalanta to the region. And in fact, the EU ended up being one of the most important actors in generating coordination in the international community in organizing the resources needed to tackle Somali piracy, and successfully so, because since 2012, that particular threat has been pretty much on hold. So that's how the EU has kind of intervened in the waters in the region. But to be honest, although that's a successful example, there's really not much more to go off when it comes to the EU, because in terms of being a security actor, well, the EU is, I would say, a rather limited security actor. It's definitely nowhere near as competent as NATO. Okay, so ultimately, in a kind of Western mindset or the European mindset, NATO was supposed to do security, and the EU was supposed to do politics and trade. Over the years, the EU has tried to develop its own kind of endogenous security policy, apparatus, resources, and so on and so forth, and has tried to a limited extent to become an international actor on security matters as well. So the anti-piracy mission was considered to be, I think, the highlight of the EU's relatively short history as an international security provider. But beyond that, in the Indian Ocean region, the EU's got a very limited presence. So it's got no permanent military presence. And to be honest, I don't think it wants one. And I don't think the region particularly necessarily wants the EU to have such a presence. And I don't think it's going to have one anytime soon because it would be too complicated to establish. The only member state which actually has a presence, a noteworthy presence in the region, is France, perhaps to a very lesser extent Germany, Spain, and Italy. France has a permanent base in Djibouti, which hosts about 2,500 permanent soldiers, if I'm not mistaken, and also has a smaller base in the UAE as well. As you know, China and India have a kind of joint naval base sharing agreement, which I think is useful for the French. And on top of that, of course, there are French overseas territories in the region, such as La Réunion, for example. So in terms of capabilities, the EU is kind of not really there or thereabouts, but it has shown in the past that if need be, it can bring itself to be reliable or trustworthy enough to actually deploy forces in case of a crisis. And as mentioned at the very outset of my presentation, the EU de facto supports Indian hegemony over the Indian Ocean region, and I don't think wants to see that change anytime soon. Now let's turn to China. This is where things get a little bit more interesting, because officially, China, when you listen to statements which are made about the region, China officially supports the status quo, but behaves like a revisionist power. I think that, at least in India, no one will disagree with me about that. Perhaps in neighboring Pakistan, people might have a different view. But I mean, as far as I see it, I mean, I teach a module on Chinese foreign policy, and I look at kind of different parts of the world, and I always ask my students, you know, what is China's end game? And is China's desire to become a regional hegemon, whether it's in the Middle East, the Gulf region, whether it's on the African continent, whether it's in the region of Latin America, whether it's in Central Asia? And of course, the answer to the question is never so straightforward, right? It's difficult to say black and white that China has become, even in East Asia, a hegemon, because you have the United States, you have Japan, you even have, to a certain extent, the agency of ASEAN countries. So it's never so clear cut when it concerns China. But deep down, I think that under the current leadership in China and the current regime, there's obviously a desire to want to change the status quo. And I think that's the same in the Indian Ocean region as well. So whether it's to the extent of China becoming the hegemon, perhaps not, but certainly undermining India's ability to do so. I think that goes without saying. So this is kind of ironic because China is, of course, also like the EU, very much dependent on the stability of the region, whether it's the Suez Canal, whether it's the Straits of Hormuz, whether it's the Indian Ocean, the Malacca Straits. China needs this to function as it does every day because of its exports and imports, and particularly its imports of natural energy and primary commodity resources, right? So, China imports a lot of that by sea. And even though through the Belt and Road Initiative, it's tried to build, kind of alternative sources, pipelines through CPEC in Pakistan, through Myanmar, to try to, lessen the dependence on kind of shipped natural resources via the Malacca Straits, the fact is that China still very much depends on it for its kind of economic well-being, right? Now, China has, of course, justified some of its assertiveness, perhaps less in the Indian Ocean, but more in the South China Sea, according to this need to kind of protect the freedom of navigation. But actually, if you look at the response or the actions undertaken in the South China Sea, they're kind of disproportionate to the threat of the chokehold or choke point in the Malacca Straits, in the sense that I think China has quite obviously greater aspirations in the South China Sea, more than just keeping open that particular choke point. In terms of its resources, actually kind of similar to the EU, China doesn't have a massive presence in the Indian Ocean region as of yet. It certainly wouldn't be welcomed, I don't think, by the majority of states. Of course, if you ask the Pakistani leadership, they might have a different opinion on that. But it's, of course, very difficult for China to justify opening up more bases because, you know, it was already hard enough opening the one that they have in Djibouti, which, of course, has been justified by, you know, China needing a base in the context of the fight against Somali piracy. China actually did have quite an important role to play there. In terms of Chinese peacekeeping operations, its contributions to peacekeeping operations in Africa, UN PKOs, and also, you know, it's justified because, you know, with the civil wars in Libya in 2011 and in Yemen in 2015, China had to evacuate Chinese citizens, 30,000 from Libya, 5,000 from Yemen, and the base in Djibouti was justified as, you know, being able to temporarily house those nationals because they had nowhere else to go after the outbreak of those particular crises. So the suggestion is in the literature, and I think particularly in the kind of strategic literature in India, from what I've read, has largely suggested that the Belt and Road Initiative and Chinese investments in the region have largely been designed in part to push forward China's strategic interests. And some, of course, have, you know, attested that this goes so far as, you know, trying to encircle India by investing particularly in port infrastructure all along the coastline of the Indian Ocean, from Tanzania in the southwestern part all the way to, you know, kind of Port Klang in Malaysia on the eastern part, you know, traversing investments in Bangladesh, in Myanmar, in Sri Lanka, in Maldives, in Pakistan, in Djibouti, and so on. So, you know, that so not only that there's the risk that China could perhaps utilize some of these investments to convert them later into maritime bases, although for now, the empirical evidence does not suggest that for now, but also to sometimes leverage these investments for political gain. So if we take, for example, 2014 in Sri Lanka, under the leadership of Mahinda Rajapaksa, Sri Lanka undertook certain actions which went against India's national security interests to the benefit of China's security interests. So what I want to say here is point to the example of the Chinese submarines docking in the ports of Colombo without the Sri Lankan authorities actually informing New Delhi beforehand, which was customary in the relationship between India and Sri Lanka. And so the feeling was that Rajapaksa and the Sri Lankans were playing upon the greater Chinese presence in Sri Lanka to undermine the quality of bilateral relations between both countries. Okay, so I think that there is a kind of a fear, and to a certain extent justified, in India that China is doing this, not just in Sri Lanka, but all around, effectively, India's neighborhood. So I think some of these actions definitely belie support for India as a regional hegemon. Okay, let's move on a little bit here. So what about the EU and China in the Indian Ocean region? What can be said about that? Well, you know, as I've kind of touched upon already, the EU and China talk a good game about a lot of things, and try to then move that to the realm of the reality under the framework of the Comprehensive Strategic Partnership. But in fact, there's really not much to say, with the exception of their bilateral cooperation in the fight against Somali piracy, particularly which peaked in around 2009, 2010. That only took place at sea, though. So, and to be honest, it was kind of reflective of the role of everyone in the international community, whether it was India, whether it was Iran, whether it was Russia, South Africa, Malaysia, the United States, NATO, Thailand. The whole international community contributed. So, in a way, this example of bilateral cooperation is more the exception rather than the rule. The rule is there's hardly been any kind of interaction between both sides. Or any form of coordination. The other example I could give, but that one is kind of losing more and more impetus, is the coordination between the EU3, which was previously the UK, France, and Germany, and China in coordinating on the Iranian nuclear issue. But if you look at what's happening now, and I'm not going to go into this, you could argue that that coordination was relevant in 2015, but it's no longer relevant in 2021. So, as mentioned, mistrust kind of characterizes their interactions. So whether it's their security interests in East Africa, in the Gulf region, in the Indian Ocean region, or in Southeast Asia, the EU and China pretty much stand polar opposites. Of course, the EU is largely kind of apprehends the developments in the South China Sea, and that's also because the EU can't really do much about it. It has to, kind of ride the wave of whatever the United States and its allies and the Quad effectively can do to stop China trying to claim more and more territory in the South China Sea. The EU has expressed concerns about the strategic dimensions of the Maritime Silk Road Initiative, and of course is opposed, hasn't been said formally, but is opposed to the opening of more Chinese bases overseas. And as far as China is concerned, it doesn't really want to have to interact with the EU on security matters because China only really wants to depend on itself. It's not really in the business of sharing or opening up. And in any case, even if it did, the truth is that the EU is not the most reliable security actor because of its own institutional shortcomings. And the fact that the member states are split when it comes to actually, either putting their eggs in the basket of foreign policy and security policy undertaken at the EU level or at the level of NATO, or sometimes in a more sporadic fashion. So, the EU is sadly not the reliable, trustworthy security actor it would like to be. Okay, so that's the state of affairs. As mentioned, there's not much to go off because the reality is that the EU and China are more rivals than partners in the Indian Ocean region, in the Indo-Pacific as a whole. And that's been made worse, of course, by European navies sending some of their ships to the South China Sea, to the Taiwan Straits, on ad hoc visits, whether it's the French, the Germans, the Dutch. Of course, this hasn't been very well coordinated at the EU level and is a bit sporadic because it's been a while since actually European navies went anywhere near that part of the world. But still, that's enough to tell China that, to let China know where Europe and the EU effectively stands with regards to China's assertiveness and revisionism in the Indo-Pacific. So looking ahead, my prognostic is not very optimistic. That won't really come as a surprise to you. I think that the state of affairs will probably remain the same or could potentially get worse. My hypothesis for that is ultimately that bilateral trust is currently running quite thin. So the sanctions on both sides with regards to the developments in Xinjiang province and on the plight of the Uyghur people, I think has really kind of only further widened the gulf between Brussels and Beijing. China was not happy with the EU sanctions and vice versa. The EU was very surprised to be on the receiving end of some of China's very first sanctions. So China sanctioned individuals in the United States government, but also certain organizations based in the US, and then did the same in the EU too. So that's obviously not made things any better. The statement that the EU and the European Commission recognizes China no longer really as a partner, but instead as a strategic rival. Well, you can't imagine that helping create any form of trust. And of course, the effect of COVID-19, which has allowed China to become even more assertive in its foreign policy. We were discussing this before the lecture. After the outbreak of COVID-19, you had Chinese assertiveness in the South China Sea, of course, along the border with India, and in many other types of instances. And that's, of course, generated a bit more mistrust between the EU and China. And of course, European countries are, wondering, like I guess many of us are, about the origins of the pandemic. What happened? And why is it that China is not necessarily playing ball when it comes to allowing a kind of fully transparent investigation into the origins of what happened back in 2019, according to reports. And so the EU has also kind of pushed this forward, like Australia, and that is much to the displeasure of the Chinese. And to add to this, of course, you've got the EU-China relations does not exist in a vacuum. It exists in a geopolitical dynamic. And if you look at the Indian Ocean region and in Indo-Pacific, where you've got quite a lot of developments which basically deal with containing China, you've got the kind of re-emergence of the Quad. You've got AUKUS recently announced. You've got the US-China rivalry, which has been, kind of sharpening under the two previous administrations and yet still under the Biden administration. You've got tension between China and India, which the EU cannot remain immune to if it supports Indian hegemony in the IOR. And then you've got Iran. So Iran, which is, of course, at loggerheads with the US, to a lesser extent with the EU. But that is a concern for Brussels when it sees that China is kind of propping up, to a certain extent, the regime in Tehran. That doesn't really go in the kind of direction which the EU is trying to push that state of affairs. So that's only kind of making, I think, the general context or the backdrop underpinning the EU and China's interactions in the Indian Ocean that much worse. And before I come to what needs to be done, the top-down management or quote-unquote management of bilateral security cooperation, which doesn't really exist, to be honest. But when on policy papers, there's lots of talk about, well, the EU and China should do this and that in terms of security cooperation. All this is devised at the level of the heads of state, okay? But in practice, as I've kind of reiterated in the presentation, there's really not much to it. There's nothing really concrete to talk about. And in fact, in the scope of the fight against Somali piracy, the EU and China only really cooperated in an ad hoc fashion. And that was driven largely by the naval officers who were working on the ground, or at sea, I should say, in attempting to resolve this particular problem. So it was not at the high level of the leaders of both sides who could have decided, well, we should cooperate here or we should cooperate there. No, it was organic. It came out of nowhere, to be honest. And of course, thereafter, the political leaders on both sides played upon this, by talking it up. But the reality is that, this came kind of out of the blue, and it hasn't been replicated since. So it just goes to show, how limited their bilateral security cooperation is. And one anecdote I'd share here is that although the EU and China cooperated in tackling the symptoms of piracy at sea, when the EU extended an invitation for China to cooperate in fighting the root causes of piracy in Somalia, the Chinese representatives said no. So that basically tells its own story. So for there to possibly be a change in the state of affairs, I think one or several of the three following points have to happen, but I'm very skeptical here. The first is the regional context needs to become less tense. Well, I don't see that happening in the short term. In the medium term, anything can happen, I suppose. The second point is that the Chinese leadership requires a change of tack. Now, as you might have seen if you take an interest in Chinese politics, Xi Jinping and Xi Jinping thought, and I guess soon to be Chairman Xi Jinping, has basically written himself into the halls of power until the time of his death, which is really a wild thing to do when you think about it, because if he doesn't know much about his country's own history, then maybe he should look back at it to know where he's possibly going wrong. But anyhow, so he's going to be president for the foreseeable future, which makes us believe that China's going to continue down this path of assertiveness. But it's not completely out of the question that maybe the hawks, which tend to dominate China's kind of top brass these days, might be replaced by more liberal-minded members of the state council. I mean, I'm not optimistic here, but it's not out of the realm of the possibility as well. And that, I think, would change many things. If you had a kind of more open-minded, more liberal, more embracing of the international community leadership around the president, maybe then China would change its stance on certain issues. But for the time being, that's not going to change. And the last element is that the EU needs to undergo serious institutional reform to become a more trustworthy security actor, as in merging foreign and security policy under the aegis of the EU, which would have to kind of entail some of the EU member states giving up their membership of NATO, dismantling and disbanding NATO, and then putting all of their eggs into the basket of the EU and generating a kind of common EU army. And again, I am not optimistic about this, because the complications involved, the politicking, even though President Macron, when he was elected, he did talk about this briefly, but that's just in passing. And ever since, that discussion has been off the drawing board. So I think that none of these factors or variables are going to, gain prominence anytime soon. And that sadly, I think that the order of the day is going to be simply more mistrust. And with that, I'd like to thank you all for your attention. And I'm willing to take any questions you may have at this time.
I request the audience, if you have any questions, please let us know, or you can directly ask the speaker.
So if you don't want to unmute your mics, which I can understand, you feel free to put the questions in the chat as well. I'm happy to take both. Okay, so.
Benjamin, there is a question from Dhruvi Agarwal. Sir, does the diplomatic boycott of Olympic have any effect on EU-China relations?
Yeah, that's a very good question. So thank you for that. I'm not sure that in the long term it's going to have that much of an effect, because it's not the first time that China has been in this position where Western dignitaries have kind of refused to participate, or threatened to not attend the opening ceremony, as was the case back in 2008 with the Beijing Olympics. I remember the president of France at the time, Nicolas Sarkozy, was in a bit of a spat with China for various reasons. He'd actually met the Dalai Lama, which is of course a no-go when it comes to bilateral relations with China, and he threatened to not attend the opening ceremony, but because in 2008, China was not the same China that we see today, and there was still a preference in the West for kind of putting the emphasis on investments and trade opportunities. Most of the leaders decided to attend because they didn't want to ruin what they saw as a good thing coming. Okay. Now we're in a slightly different context in the sense that the rhetoric coming out of the West and the EU too is, talking of divestments, decoupling, trying to move supply chains outside of China to other countries, trying to put a cap on investments into China, containing China geopolitically. So it's not so controversial, if you like, to say, well, I don't want to attend the Beijing Olympic Games, for example, in China. And you might have seen, was it yesterday, a recent ruling by an international tribunal condemning China about what's happening in Xinjiang province. So I think that China's easily being castigated as the kind of black sheep in the international community now. So this boycott by European leaders, by Justin Trudeau, by Joe Biden, by diplomats, I mean, it's not entirely surprising. It's simply going to add to this kind of general mistrust I've been touching upon. And I don't think that the Chinese leadership is particularly concerned. I mean, probably they would prefer if there was no controversy, but at the same time, the leadership in China that will be able to utilize this, in terms of playing up upon the cards of nationalism, saying, look, to the Chinese people, look at the West again, condemning us, treating us in a certain way, sullying our reputation. So, things have got so bad already that does this really make a difference? I don't think so. I think it's more symbolic. The other element to add to this is one more of domestic politics. So now, and I guess this is also relevant to India, it's become popular for politicians to use China for their own political gain. So Trump did it in America. He blacklisted China, and he tried to portray himself as the guardian, the protector of American society against the evil coming from China. So I think leaders in democratically elected states are now using China, or the China card, in a way to boost their own popularity ratings. So any opportunity is good. And Joe Biden or any other European leaders saying that they're not going to attend, well, actually maybe civil society or the electorate, that's what they want to hear. Because if you look at China's appeal or popularity in polls around the world, it's dropping tremendously since COVID-19. I don't think that's of concern to the Chinese leadership, but it makes a difference in kind of democratic states whether China's going to be used as a kind of as a whipping board, which is currently the case now. So I don't think it makes that much of a difference to the current general status of affairs.
Yeah, there is one more question from Kritika Gautam. How much would China's future as a hegemon would impact EU?
Well, if we're talking, let's start first by talking regionally. So, I think China's first aim is to become a hegemon in Asia, in the Indo-Pacific, the Asia-Pacific. I think it doesn't really matter. At least in where I currently am, for sure, China would love to become the regional hegemon and displace the United States and force the United States out of the region for various reasons, connected to Chinese sovereignty and the like, Taiwan, the South China Sea, and so on and so forth. Now, what would that mean for the EU? That would be very bad news for the EU, I think, because, of course, of the EU's dependency on trade with the region, not just with China, but also with Japan, with Taiwan, and with ASEAN countries too. So I don't think that's in the EU's interest in any shape or form to have China become a hegemon there. So the EU is kind of part of this general pushback against China. Now let's imagine this spread to the Indo-Pacific as a whole, which I think is unlikely, but let's imagine it for a second. Again, likewise, that would not be in the EU's interest, and I think the EU would, I think, try even harder to make sure that that doesn't happen. And lastly, in terms of a potential global hegemon, which is, I think, is a very long way off ever happening, the EU would definitely be side by side with the rest of the world, which doesn't want China to become the kind of global hegemon, in pushing back. So that would be with the United States, with Japan, with select, with India, with select partners from across the world. So, yeah, I think that's pretty much where the EU stands on that matter.
Thank you, Benjamin. Thank you. So we have come to the end of the program, and I would like to thank Benjamin Barton, who is the speaker of today's program. Heartfully, I thank you, Benjamin, because of your busy schedule and pressing issues need to be resolved. But even then, you have scheduled, you have made some time to be a part of this program, and we are very happy to have you to speak on the China and EU in the Indian Ocean region. And I would like to thank our Honorable Vice Chancellor, sir, and Honorable Registrar, sir, for giving this opportunity to establish the center and to organize such insightful events. And I would also like to thank our participants, and not the least, I would like to thank our members of the center for providing the technical support and organizing this program. Thanks a lot to all the participants.
Thank you.
Thank you, Benjamin.
You're welcome. It's my pleasure. Thank you again for the kind invitation and for all the participants and the questions. Much appreciated.
Thank you.
Take care and see you soon.
Yes. Thank you, sir.
Bye-bye.